Hello coders, this is Jared with Renaissance Coders, and today we are continuing with our Intro to JavaScript series by covering functions in JavaScript. Functions in JavaScript are like most methods or functions in other programming languages, in that a function is essentially a sequence of statements that does things, right? So we can have a function that does something like adding two numbers together, for example. Functions can be passed values, and these values that are passed are called parameters or arguments, and functions can return values. Now, in JavaScript, functions are objects of type function, and these can be manipulated like any other object. Okay, so let's get started with some code. The first thing that we need to learn how to do is define our functions. There are multiple ways to define functions, but for this intro video, we are just going to focus on the simple method. And when you're defining a function in JavaScript, you have to use the keyword function, and then you have to give the function a name. So here I'm just going to call this name. And then inside of the parentheses, you have to pass the arguments, or you have to give the arguments a name. And for this one, I'm just going to say arg1, arg2. Okay, and then you open up your curly braces, and inside of this, you would do something like var total is equal to arg1 plus arg2. Okay? And then we can do something like return total. Okay, so again, that's just a really basic definition of how to create a function. You have to use this function keyword, you have to name the function, you pass in the arguments, and then you do stuff to the arguments inside of the function. Okay, so let's create a slightly more advanced function. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to create a function squared, and it's going to take a single number. I'm just going to call that number, open up my curly braces, and I'm going to return number times number. Okay, and so based on the name of this function and what this is actually doing, you can probably tell that this is just squaring a number that we're passing in. So, one important thing to do when you're naming your functions is always name them according to what they're doing, or something that you will remember. Because if you don't name them appropriately, then when you're going back and looking at your code later, you can definitely run into some issues, where I don't know where this function is, or what is this function actually doing. And if someone else has to look at your code, it's always really nice to look at code that you can tell someone has taken the time to really think about what they're calling their functions. Okay, so let's now take a look at how to call our function. And calling your function is really easy. And for this example, I'm actually just going to do a document.write, so that way we can see the output. And now I'm going to actually call my function inside of this write method, and I'm going to call squared. I'm going to pass the value of 4 here. Okay, so we know how to do a square to get the squared value of 4, which is 16. So if I zoom out, you can see that 16 is actually being printed to the screen here. So that function is working appropriately. Okay, now let's zoom back in on our JavaScript here. So now that we finished that really basic function, let's create a more advanced function. Say one for like sales tax. So essentially, before you start a function, you need to stop and think about what is this function going to need. And this function is actually going to need the cost of an item, the tax percentage, and what we're going to output is going to be the original cost, the taxed amount, and the cost plus the tax. Okay, there are a couple of ways to write this function. One way would be to define the tax amount outside of the function so that the tax amount does not really change. So let's write that method out. Okay, and I'm just going to scroll down a little bit here. Alright, and what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go ahead and declare a variable tax rate. Okay, and I'm going to set that equal to 0.09. So we've got a tax percentage of 9%. Okay, and the next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to declare my function. I'm going to call this total cost. Okay, and this is just going to take in, oops, sorry about that. This is just going to take in one argument, which is the cost of the item we're purchasing. Okay, and then I'm going to open up my curly braces. Okay, and like I said before, we're going to have a couple of document.write statements here. So we're going to write out the cost, we're going to write out the tax, and we're going to write out the final amount. So let's go ahead and document dot write. We're going to do a string of cost plus cost. Okay, another document dot write, and this one's actually just going to be a break. Document dot write. Okay, and now what we're actually going to do is we're going to figure out the tax. And so to do that, we're actually going to do document.write tax as a string, and we're going to say tax plus, or the concatenation operator, plus cost times tax rate. Okay, so essentially what this is going to do is it's going to take whatever's inside of the variable cost, multiply that by our set tax rate, and then write that to the screen. Okay, and I'm just going to copy this break statement. Okay, and I'm actually going to create another variable here, and this variable is going to be called tax amount. And this tax amount is going to be equal to the cost times the tax rate. Okay, and I'm really just doing this for simplicity's sake. And I'm going to create another var, and I'm going to call this total amount. And I'm going to set total amount equal to cost plus the tax amount. Okay, so this last variable is the total cost, right? It's the original cost plus the cost times the tax rate. So this would be like if you're at a restaurant and you order something, you know, there's always going to be a tax rate on that, or really if you buy anything pretty much anywhere except for online, you have to pay a tax rate on that. And this would be the final amount owed for that. Okay, and what we're going to do is we're just going to document.write, and this is going to be total. Okay, plus total amount. Okay, and that's pretty much going to do it for this function here. You know, again, it's a fairly simple function. We've got a lot of document.write function or document.write methods in here, which kind of make the function look a little more heavy than it actually is, but you know, it's just a very simple function. Let me put one more break statement up here because I know that's going to look weird without it. And I'm going to actually go ahead and call this total cost function, and I'm going to put 20 in as my argument for this function. Okay, and now I'm going to zoom out. Okay, and as you can see, again, we're getting 16 from the squared function, which we should be getting, and then we're getting a cost of 20, which is what we entered into the function call. Okay, and so our tax is $1 and essentially 80 cents. You know, JavaScript actually rounds that up when you look at the total. But so this would actually probably be 1.79 cents. So our total, if it was not rounded, would be 21.79 cents. Okay, so that's working like it should, right? Now what we want to do is we actually want to go ahead and look at the second method that I talked about earlier. And the second method is taking in both the tax percentage and the cost as arguments. This function would be better for creating something like a tax calculator. So let's say, you know, you're building a tax calculator for your website, you know, and you want the user to be able to enter the cost and how much they're paying in tax, right? So that's what the second function is really going to be used for. And let me just enter a bunch of enters there so that way you guys can get it sort of in the center of the screen. Just going to zoom back in. Okay, now let's go ahead and write out our next function here. And that's going to be, I'm going to call it function tax calc. Oops, sorry. And we're just going to take in two arguments this time, cost and tax percentage. Okay, open up our curly braces, and again, the first thing we're going to do here is we're going to document.write the cost plus cost, and then document.write a break. I just pasted that from earlier, and we're going to do a var of tax amount, and that's going to be equal to the cost times the tax percentage. And now we're going to document.write tax plus the tax amount here. Okay? And again, add a break statement. And really I'm just doing this break statement so that way it's just a little bit, I guess, prettier on the screen, you know, so that way it's way more legible for us. All right, and so the last thing we need to do to this function is we need to do a var total amount is equal to cost plus tax amount. Okay, and we're just again going to do a document dot write total. Oops, sorry about that. And plus total amount here. Okay, and again, as you can see, it's very similar to the previous function. The only real difference here is that we're taking in two arguments. We're taking in a cost argument. We're taking in a tax percentage argument. So really, this function, I guess, is a little more extensible. It can do more. So let's go ahead and call this, and I'm going to say tax calc, and I'm going to do 20 as the cost again, and then 0.09 as our tax percentage. Okay, and I'm going to zoom out. Oh, forgot my first break. There we go. All right, so let me scroll down, and this is the new function here, and again, it's exactly the same as the previous, and that's kind of what we wanted. Now, one limitation of this tax calc function is the fact that the user can input, or you could easily input when you're writing when you're calling your function, you could put like 20 in as the tax percentage, and obviously you're going to get some really weird values here. So let's say you are actually building this to take in user input, then you would definitely want to have some sort of check here to make sure that the tax percentage actually makes sense. So let's take a look at what it would take to create some checks inside of our function. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to actually manipulate this tax calc function here. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create an if statement. And this if statement is just going to say if tax percentage is greater than 1. Okay, so we're really only checking to see if the value of the tax is greater than 1, so it's greater than 100% essentially, then we're going to document.write this tax percentage does not make sense. Okay, and again, we're just going to add our break statement here. And now if I zoom out, we're not going to see that statement printed anywhere because our tax amount is not currently greater than 1. So let's modify this call here to be 2.5. Okay, and now when this refreshes down here, oh, sorry about that, I forgot another break statement. Alright, so now when this refreshes, you can see we've got this tax percentage does not make sense. And I've actually got an extra break here. And then we're looking at the cost, and the cost is 20. That's right, okay? Our tax is actually 50, okay? So that's 20 times 2.5, okay? Which we definitely don't want. That's definitely incorrect, at which throws off our total, and our total goes up to 70, right? So that's definitely not what we want to have happen. And I know some of you who have developed before or have written some code before, you're probably looking at this function and saying, man, I would never write that. And trust me, I wouldn't write it this way either. So let's write this out like responsible developers. When developing responsibly, we should really try to take every scenario into account, and we should also try to create our programs so that they fail gracefully. So what does failing gracefully mean? Essentially what that means is that even though we're getting values that we don't want, we can still manipulate those and work those into the function, or we can give some valuable feedback to the user. So just saying this tax percentage doesn't make sense is not valuable to the user, Essentially we're saying, what are you writing? That doesn't make sense. It's not helpful. So what we're going to do now is we're actually going to rewrite this function to account for all of the different values that can really be entered into this. And what we're going to do is we're going to do an if, else if, and an else statement. So our if statement is going to check to see if the entered tax amount is greater than 1. If it is, then we need to change that, right? Then our else if statement is going to check to see if the tax amount is less than 0. And if it is, then we also need to do something to that, right? So let's go ahead and dive into that and see what we can do to account for these different scenarios. Again, I'm just going to go back down into CodePen here, zoom in. Okay, and what I'm actually going to do here is I'm going to write a function, new calc, and I'm going to do, again, two parameters, cost and tax percentage. Okay, open up my curly braces. And again, like I said, we're going to do our if statement, and it's going to say if tax percentage is greater than 1. Okay, so essentially what we're saying here is, let's say someone entered in 2.5 as our tax percentage, which makes perfect sense, from a spoken point of view, but not from a calculations point of view. So this is probably an issue that's going to happen if you write a program like this, because a lot of people won't think I need to convert this to the actual decimal value. So what we're going to do here is we're actually going to say, open up our curly braces, and we're going to say bar new tax percentage is equal to tax percentage divided by 100. Okay, so what you're going to do is you're going to divide the original input by 100. So if someone entered in 2.5, then we'd actually end up with a value of 0.025 here. Okay, and then we're going to do a document.write corrected tax amount, and we're going to write out our new tax percentage here. Okay, sorry about that, my screen kind of went a little freaky on me there. Okay, but we also have to do several things inside, a few more things inside of this if statement, and that's going to be to write out our document.write, and we're going to do a break here. Copy that. And we're going to, again, we're just going to do a lot of the same things we did before. So we're actually just doing a document.write cost plus cost break, and we're actually going to do our tax amount now. So var tax amount is equal to cost times new tax percentage. Make sure you use the right tax percentage there. Percentage. Okay, document.write tax plus tax amount. Okay, and another break, and then var total amount. Okay, and we're going to do the total amount is equal to cost plus the tax amount. Oh, don't forget your semicolons. And we're going to do a document.write total plus total amount. Okay, and that's going to do it for our if statement. And essentially, again, all this is doing is it's creating a new tax percentage if the original tax percentage is greater than 1, and then doing our normal sort of calculations and output. Now what we want to actually do, though, is we want to move on and start writing out our else if statement. So I'm just going to write out else if. We're going to do tax percentage is less than 0. So, if you get an input like this, it kind of means that someone's sort of screwing with the program and trying to see if they can break it or not. And trust me, I've had instructors do that. When testing my programs in the past, they'll say, okay, I'm just going to enter in some random value here and see what happens. So you definitely want to sort of account for those, because you never know what's going to happen in the real world. So what we're going to do here is we're going to say else if tax percentage is less than 0. Then we're going to do new tax percentage. And you probably noticed that I didn't do var new tax percentage. And I'm not doing that because I actually declared it up here, so I don't have to declare it again. And we're going to set that equal to math.absolute value, which is the ABS method. And that's going to return a positive version of that number. Okay, and we also need to do another if statement inside of this. So let's say someone enters in a negative 2.5. Well, just converting that to a positive is not going to work. So we also have to check and see if it's greater than 1. And if new tax percentage is greater than 1, then we need to do the same thing we did before and say new tax percentage is equal to new tax percentage divided by 100. So sort of the same thing we did in our original if statement. Okay, now what we want to do is we want to do those same document.writes and same calculations. So I'm just going to go ahead and write those out. Document.write positive tax plus new tax percentage. Okay, and then we're going to do our break. Yes, I still had it copied. And then another document dot write for the cost, and that's just going to be plus cost. Okay, another break, and now we're going to actually do our tax amount again. And again, I'm not declaring this because I'm not declaring this as a var because I actually declared it earlier. And our tax amount is going to be equal to cost times new tax percentage, and make sure you're using the new one here. Again, we created this for a reason, so make sure you're actually using it when you start doing these calculations. So tax amount is equal to cost times new tax percentage, and we're actually going to just document dot write tax plus tax amount. Okay, break, and then again we just need to find the total, which is total amount is equal to cost plus tax amount. And one last document dot right here, total plus total amount. Okay, and that's going to do it for our else if, that's going to cover all of that. So the last thing we need to do is actually going to be our else statement here. And our else statement is really just going to essentially be what we wrote out earlier. It's just going to be the same functionality that we had earlier. And that was just sort of document.write cost plus cost break tax amount is equal to cost times tax percentage, and then we're going to document dot write tax plus tax amount break statement. Okay, and the last thing is we have to do a total amount is equal to cost plus tax amount. All right, and we're going to document dot write total plus total amount here. Okay, and that's going to pretty much do it for this new function. And this is, again, it's covering a lot of different scenarios here. And it is a pretty long function, especially just doing tax calculations, but we're really covering a lot of different scenarios. Pretty much the only scenario we're not covering is if someone enters anything other than a number inside of our tax percentage argument. Okay guys, as you can see, I've gone ahead and commented everything out that we wrote earlier. I did that just so we can have like a clean slate so we can look at everything, so we're rapidly changing these values. And what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to call new calc, and I'm going to use that base value of 20, and I'm going to do our original test of 0.09 first. Okay, and as you can see, these are the exact same values that we had before. So, our else statement is working fine. The next thing I want to actually do here, though, is I want to change this to a 9. So I'm changing the tax percentage to a 9. Okay, and as you can see, it is correcting the tax amount to 0.09, which it should be. And again, we're getting the correct value down here. Now, again, the last thing is a -9. All right, and as you can see, this has worked again. Okay guys, so that's going to do it for our basic introduction to functions in JavaScript. Like I said before, there are multiple ways to create functions, but we won't cover that until we get into our later intermediate JavaScript tutorial series. Okay, now you guys should have a fair understanding of how to create basic functions using JavaScript. Now, I made sure to include several variations and some best practices for you guys so that you can go out and start creating some of your own JavaScript functions. If you like these videos or the series, be sure to drop us a like or subscribe. And as always, thanks for watching, and this has been a Renaissance Coders tutorial.